friends. My name is Tikva, and I'm on staff here at Southridge. And I'm also an immerse student at Northwest Seminary. So this moment is like my world is just coming together. So this is really fun for me. Just a bit of, they asked me to share the origin story of how we got here. And it actually starts with my brother, Daniel. He is currently a professor at Redeemer Christian University in Hamilton. But before that, he actually worked at Ravi Zacharias Ministries. And so many of you would probably be familiar with that. My brother was a Christian apologist who worked for Ravi. And he was working with Ravi when the story came out of all these allegations of really horrible sexual abuse that Ravi did. And this horrible story came out, and there was a lot of people denying it. And my brother, at the time, he was part of a crew that helped these people come to know what was really going on. And it was in that time that they were processing, trying to figure out what to do when you have this big Christian organization and something so awful happen, that they reached out to Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer to just ask for advice in this really difficult time. And so they helped them, and yeah, which was just so incredible. And so fast forward several years, and now I'm doing the Immerse program, and I had an assignment to study abuse both inside and outside the church. And so I knew exactly who I needed to call to try to get me connected to someone who could really help me process those things. And so I asked my brother Daniel, I was like, who can you get me connected to? And he said, you have to talk to Laura. And so we got on a Zoom call, me and Laura, and we just had a really incredible conversation as I am a young leader trying to figure out ministry for the first time. And we were able to talk through just what makes healthy leaders, what makes safe churches. And so from there, I got her connected to Greg. And next thing you know, we are all here together. And so that's kind of how we're here. And Laura and I were actually talking today just how incredible God is, that he could take something as awful as a situation with Ravi. And now we're all here doing whatever we can to fight against abuse in our own churches. And so that's just a moment to thank God for that. And so before Laura comes up, I just want to share her bio with you. Laura is a veteran public school educator, writer, and speaker, and she is a co-author of the award-winning A Church Called Tove and Pivot, the priorities, practices, and powers that can transform your church into a culture of Tove. Her work explores the formation of church culture through the lens of Tove, the biblical vision of goodness that resists abuse and cultivates healing, truth, and grace. In addition to her work with adult audiences, Laura co-authored the children's version of the Jesus Creed and developed a companion teacher guide, reflecting her long-standing commitment to spiritual formation in both classroom and church settings. She's a practicing fellow with Baylor University's Center for School Leadership, a graduate of Wheaton College. Laura lives in the suburbs of Chicago with her husband, Mark, and their research beagles. So let's give a warm welcome to Laura.
Testing. Okay. Thank you, Tikva. It's so good to be with all of you. This is my first time in Vancouver, and I felt so welcomed, particularly by Tikva and Greg and the Southridge staff and Michael. Allow me a moment to introduce myself. Like Tikva said, I'm a school teacher and I teach kindergarteners. And that means if you look at the size of the chair that you're sitting on, that's about the typical height of my students. And so I'm not really accustomed to people actually looking at me while I'm talking. I'm usually spending my time trying to convince them to look at me and listen while I'm teaching. And we finished our school year just about a week ago, and I said goodbye to this group of 5 and 6-year-olds. This is a photo of my class this year. It tells you how I spend my day working hours, right? Here we are at our Christmas party. That's me in the middle in my natural habitat. If any of you have served or will serve in kids ministries, you probably know one of the best things about teaching young children is their brutal honesty. Recently, one of them was like, "You look like a witch," he told me. I was like, "Why?" He goes, "Your hair's sticking out everywhere. You really should brush it before you teach." So he said, give me this advice. So if you ever want to hear the truth about yourself, I highly recommend stepping into your kids' ministry. So I'm a school teacher and I am also the author of a few books that I wrote with my dad. I would not be an author if it were not for him. You may have heard of him. His name is Scott McKnight. He is a well known theologian, authority on the Bible, and he has written many books, particularly for seminary students, often read him. And by the way, I told him, I said, Dad, we cannot name our next book Pivot. And probably many of you have heard or watched this scene, one of my favorite Friends episodes. This is a direct quote. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said. No one has ever heard of that show. It won't be a problem. And I was like, yeah, I think they have heard of the show. And now this is what we get from him. I don't know how to press play. Just don't do it. Okay. Okay. So at any rate, he's now acting out pivot scenes with copies of our book. So that's how far that he's come. I'm going to mention him often tonight. So I thought there's no better way to introduce you to the real Scott McKnight. He is a theologian. He also has a really great sense of humor. We wrote Tove together, obviously. And whenever I need a theologian to check my work, I text him whenever, like I did for this talk tonight. Whenever I need a theologian to explain something, I text him. I don't know another New Testament scholar that's available to me at all hours of the day. So texting my dad is what I do. I know as a student, you're not supposed to depend too much on one source, but I have one source. It's my dad. He's overused, but I think he's okay. So I quite literally became an author without planning to do that. Like I said, I spend my days with children. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story, how this came to be, and then we can jump into Tove and culture, which is the reason why you're all here tonight. The Chicago Tribune is the major newspaper in the city of Chicago where I live. And this article was published in March of 2018. I was telling Tikva before dinner, or we had dinner together tonight. I can remember the exact place where I was sitting when I read this article for the first time. It's about the pastor, Bill Hybels, and Willow Creek Church. And this article became one of the biggest stories in Christian circles in Chicago and in the United States. Some of you are nodding. Maybe you're aware of the story. Well, it was more than just a news article for me. Willow was my former church. Bill Hybels was my former pastor. My husband and I met at Willow. I was baptized by Bill as a young adult. And then, even worse, it was our friends or people that we knew that were accusing him of misconduct. And then it took time for us to understand the full story, but it was the church, it was our former pastor and leaders um, telling the worldwide community that our friends were lying, that they were making up a story to take Bill down before he retired. And we really wanted to believe the church, but we believed the women. And it became apparent that you really could only believe one because their stories were opposite. And that made us, because we believed the women, it made us enemies of the church and of its staff and even of the Hybels family. I would not have called myself an enemy at the time, but I see that now. But we believed the women and they were telling the truth. And they needed somebody with influence to advocate for them. And that's where my dad stepped in. He had been reading and watching Willow Creek's responses, and he would casually just kind of cut through their narratives and point instead to what felt like truth. It was like settling to my soul to hear him explain they're using Matthew 18 was a big one, for example, like a weapon. It was being used to silence the victims and to guilt them and to shame them. And he would explain to us that's not the context that it should be used. He would point us to other scripture instead. And I now understand that what was happening was a spiritually abusive thing to do. Instead, he said the victims' voices were prophetic, and speaking out about injustice is all over the Bible. It's called prophetic prophetic action he taught me. So I knew the larger community, or I naively thought everybody needs to hear this about, they need to hear a biblical scholar, a theologian speak truth into the situation. So I really started to bother him a lot about writing about Willow, what he was teaching us privately. He would be like, Laura, I do not want to get involved. I have other things to do. I don't want to get in the middle of this. But I could not let it go. I feel maybe God fired me up inside about it. And I happen to be really good at pestering people because I do it all day long professionally with 5-year-olds. Eventually, he did feel led, like, by a larger call bigger than my pestering, um, beyond my pleading. So he ended up writing a blog post to Willow Creek that was very widely read at the time, including by its top leadership. And eventually, I helped him write. We started with the false narratives chapter, if you remember that from a church called Tove. And eventually we wrote together the book that became Tove. And it all started with this article here in the Chicago Tribune. And honestly, I had no idea the plans that God had for us or for the book or for the impact that it would make in the United States and beyond. I had disappeared. I was submitted the manuscript, disappeared back into kindergarten, submitted the manuscript, like I said, and just really thinking, oh, that was fun. Like, thank you, God, so much for that opportunity. Thinking the Tove work was behind me. And I really failed to consider what would happen. Like, oh, people actually read the book and they're interested in it. And here we are 6 years later, still having this conversation. I did not expect to be writing and speaking or being here with you in Canada. It's not something that I ever could have planned. But looking back now over the last 5.5 years, I think it's been, I learned how desperately we need you. We need pastors. We need ministry leaders. You sitting here tonight. We need those of us who follow you need you to be shaped by the goodness of the one we all follow and to be formed by his spirit from the inside of you. We need you to let his goodness transform you and to guide you, to let him form you first. And then after that slow inner work has taken root, then influence your culture from who you are, from your character. And I'm getting ahead of myself though. That's my thesis for tonight, but that's overall probably the biggest lesson that I've taken away. So I'm going to start by praying for you, praying over us, and then we'll get into the content of Tove. Does that sound good? Okay, pray with me. Heavenly Father, who is always near us, including right here, right now, may your name be treasured and loved in this space tonight. May your reign be done in all of us sitting here this evening, and your will be done right here in this very gathering, in just the way it's being done right now in heaven. Give us tonight the very things we need for tonight as we sit in this room together. And God, forgive us for the ways that we've fallen short, even just today, as we are at the same time working really hard to forgive those who have offended or hurt us. It is a process, God. Please protect us from trials tonight. But if you don't, that's okay. Give us the character to sustain us through them, even if hard topics or thoughts are raised that we'd rather avoid. For you are the one in charge tonight. You have all the power, and all the restoration we seek in ourselves, in our communities, comes from you. The glory is all yours forever, God. It's really the way we want it. It's yours, it's not ours. Thank you for being with us now. Shape us and our cultures into who you would have us become by your grace. Amen. All right, let's begin. So, I'm going to first tell you about Tove and what it is, and then give you an overview of the circle of Tove from our book. Tove, you may know, is an ancient Hebrew word, and it means good or goodness. God is Tov and he does only Tov. And this word I have learned again from my dad. And most of you probably know this as seminary people. But if you open your Bible to the very first page of Genesis, you'll read Tov 7 times. And I've learned that it follows again more than 700 times in the Old and New Testament. So I've learned, my dad tells me that it is really hard to overstate the importance of Tov as one of like the most major moral categories of our Bible. And what do Christians believe about God? Well, this I've learned is a good place to start, that he is good. And I couldn't help but think of C.S. Lewis here and his wonderful character Aslan from Narnia. Another of my favorite storybook characters, the Beavers, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, describe this good lion to Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy for the first time. They said, Mr. Beaver said, "Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more." And our Bible could be called the message of Tov because the gospel is God's Tov, Jesus coming to us and then forming us into people who then do his Tov. And that is Tov, as I understand it, again, from my one overused source, Scott McKnight. So are we good so far? Everyone with me? So let's look next at the habits that develop Tov, goodness in cultures. But this is where a goodness culture starts. It starts with you and who you are becoming. Here is our circle of Tov, I think. Circle of Tov. There it is. It outlines the 7 habits of a Tov culture. These habits could really be rearranged in any order. There's no particular magic about which order they come in. But when they're active in a culture, they will cultivate goodness. So they will seep and flow and they will spread and leak over time and they will shape the people and the culture towards goodness. And of course, people are messy, so cultures will be messy. And of course, there will be bumps along the way and things you can't foresee. But the arc will bend towards goodness. And then each Tov habit will resist its opposite. I've learned that's the opposite of Tov, I learned is the Hebrew word Ra, R-A. That's the toxic partner. And people have asked, why did you pick these 7 habits? Well, it's because the problems came first. And they were consistent as we talked to churches and read and spoke with survivors and read some more. They just kept rising to the surface. And we certainly were very shaped by Willow Creek and what happened, and that influence is in it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with James McDonald and the Harvest Bible Chapel. That's down the road from us too. So it was a lot of listening, and I'm sure that there's more Tov habits. I'd love to hear your ideas if you have others. This is certainly not comprehensive, but they came from talking and listening and studying. I think they're at least a really good place to start with cultivating Tov and goodness in your culture. So I'm going to summarize the circle really briefly. I call each of them like a stop around the circle, and each stop includes a habit of goodness, and then it's ra, it's bad opposite. So first, empathy. Empathy will cultivate goodness within a culture. In contrast, self-absorbed habits will leak into cultures that are influenced by self-absorbed people, right? Those who lack empathy, maybe because for whatever reason, maybe because of unhealed wounds or whatever the reason. And we're going to come back to this and dive deeper into empathy tonight, the first stop on the circle. I'm going to actually go on a big tangent with it, but fair warning, I'll tell you more about that later. So the next stop is grace. People live in fear in some unhealthy, raw cultures. They're afraid to speak up because of various reasons that are active in the culture. So a woman I know I talked to her last week or the week before. She was recently fired from her church because she raised concerns about possibly gender bias in the church. And she got left out of meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really not the point. But she brought her concerns to the elders, who then told the pastor about her concerns, and then he immediately fired her. Was retaliation. And this spring, an Illinois court actually found him guilty of workplace retaliation. But so that's an example of what that looks like. But grace, the opposite, will feed a culture. Instead of fear, it'll feed it with goodness. And then we call the next stop institution creep. It means the church operates like a business. It feels like a corporation instead of a church. So decisions can feel really cold. They can feel really uncaring. This is how the Willow Creek women felt when they would interact with Willow, because the decisions about how to treat them were cold. They were uncaring. Decisions were made that could just feel very ruthless. Bill Hybels had everyone knew he had a hatchet man. That's what he was called. And alternatively, caring for people, putting them first instead of the image of the institution, that will instead feed goodness into the culture. Telling the truth, the next stop, that should be a given, right? In communities that follow Christ, and sometimes it's not. Narrative spinning does not feed goodness into a culture, not surprisingly. This was the first chapter that we wrote in a church called Tove, and it's where our book started. Again, we were heavily influenced by what we saw coming out of Willow. A lot of narrative spinning, so much so that the truth was twisted so much that it really was no longer the truth. Next stop, demanding loyalty to a leader creates problems in the culture, obviously. People have to be loyal, or they are fired, or mistreated, or demoted. Justice instead will feed a culture with goodness. Okay, celebrity culture, the next stop, that means the pastor is treated, and his inner circle or her inner circle are treated as more important than everybody else. So the celebrity pastor can become very unreachable. Bill Hybels had bodyguards when he would walk through the building of Willow Creek. And I don't know, maybe that was necessary, but it certainly made him unreachable. You could not just talk to the pastor. He had a separate entrance to the church, he had a garage under his office. So when I say unreachable, he was literally like unreachable. Um, I read the gospels, and I Jesus really did not behave that way, right? He served, he spent time with people, he spent time with people on the outside. This is what feeds a culture with goodness. And finally, my dad gets really fired up about this one. Leadership culture has filtered into churches. My dad is on a rampage about pastors are not leaders. And he's really big on this one. He's like, pastors are pastors. Look at this word cloud that he made using the words from Willow Creek's job description. They were looking for a pastor, sort of looks like a CEO, to replace Hybels. And then now look at this word cloud, the words that the Bible actually uses to describe a pastor. And here they are side by side. The differences are obvious. I asked him one time, I said, Dad, how much did Jesus really talk about leadership? We heard this a lot at Willow Creek, leadership. Um, and he's like, about zero, he told me. And so conversely, discipling people into being like Christ is what will nurture goodness. So that is like the quick overview of our Tove circle. And we hope that it provides a big picture sort of place to start. These habits of goodness will form people who will then form cultures slowly over time through decisions and actions that are sometimes large, they're sometimes small, but it's not instant, right? That's not character formation is not instantaneous. It's not meant to be quick. One of my favorite authors, Dr. Chuck DeGroat, and I'm going to talk more about him later on my tangent that I'm going to go on. He says character is revealed over time through the habits of the heart, and the choices that emerge naturally from deeply rooted conviction rather than the whims of circumstance. I love how he says that. And one more word, and then I'm going to get it to my tangent about that first stop on the circle, empathy and its opposite. I have sat with this circle now for a few years since we wrote it in 2019, 2020-ish. And as I've spent time in it, like literally and figuratively, and I've absorbed it and just kind of lived in it, if you will. I've really come to believe that that first stop on the circle, empathy or compassion, is with Tove, the foundation of the circle, right? In fact, I said, Dad, I feel like we should just move empathy into the middle with Tove. I tried, like, let's move it, right? He said no, but he said we could put generosity there. And I'm going to tell you why, because he said that Tove's most important expression is generosity. Tove is generosity, and generosity is Tove. They intermingle and they overlap. So my dad pointed to me to this. In the parable of workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20, the owner, who represents God in the story, says, "Are you envious because I am generous?" The ESV translation says, "Do you begrudge my generosity?" And the Greek word for generosity, I learned, is agathos. I'm probably not saying that correctly, but it's another word for good. If it were a Hebrew translation, the word would be tov. Do you begrudge my goodness? So to be tov is to be generous. And I'll say it like I would for my students. I'll just simplify it. They're the same word. Okay. Um, to be Tove is to be a person who, from the inside out, consistently does what is generous. It's who you are, it's what the culture is, it's who you are becoming as you surrender to the work of the Spirit over time. It's what the culture is and what the culture is becoming. And where I've landed with this circle, then, each of these habits of goodness are rooted in a posture of generosity flowing from compassion, like justice and serving, receiving grace, receiving it and giving it, putting people first ahead of the reputation of the institution. They all flow out of a person or a culture's generous posture. And truth is a little different. I get that. But I've really come to think that generosity links them all through Tove. A Tove person and a Tove culture will just live generously. It's who they are and what the culture is. And so, for this reason, you guys are the first to see it publicly. We updated our Tove circle. We put generosity right there in the middle. Tove people are compassionate. Their compassionate responses elicit generosity, and those responses radiate into the habits of goodness. So I'd love to know what you think. I'm still working it out in my head. But for me, it makes it more concrete, like more actionable to have generosity there, that shift. The theologian who checks my work said it's okay, but would love your feedback. So, we don't have time tonight to get into each of these habits deeply. There's much more information in our books about them. I thought, because this topic keeps coming up, we're going to settle into the first stop, the empathy stop, and eventually its opposite, what resists it. And I'm going to switch to the word compassion now because empathy, I feel like compassion goes a step further than empathy. Like empathy is the feeling to me, but compassion is like the response to the feeling. So I'm going to switch to compassion. But we need to know how to be compassionately Tove, right? Um, it's not entirely effective when I tell my students, okay, everybody go be kind without modeling what it looks like. They have to see it. They have to see it modeled for them over time, consistently, what it looks like, what it does not look like. And we Christian cultures, we have the greatest model of goodness. We have Jesus. We get to watch him and learn from him and be like him as he as we encounter him, as we encounter his goodness and he guides us, he is our reason for being and our reason for becoming. So I want to learn compassion from him. Let's learn compassion from him, our good teacher, before I talk about its opposite. I recently found myself immersed in the Gospel of Matthew and simultaneously watching the Bible Project's. Do you guys watch the Bible Project? Oh, it's so great. Yeah, their video series. I see some hands, some video series on Matthew, and I was captured by this sketch from one of their videos. There's a screenshot of it. At the beginning of his ministry, Jesus announced the good news of his kingdom, and then Matthew follows with these 9 life transforming examples of generous compassion. I was so moved. I sat in my backyard. I was like lost in the first century and was just so moved as I read about Jesus's displays of compassion with these people. All of his actions restored. He he restored the suffering, wounded, weak, diseased, disabled people. I mean, look at the generosity. He gave life to the dead and calmed the wind and waves of the Sea of Galilee and forgave sins, right? Which maybe is the most life giving, generous, most healing act that he did. And so I sat in my backyard as I'm reading the Gospels, and I felt the Spirit whisper to me about that sick mother in law in the top right corner of the sketch. This is, you probably know this, is the disciple Peter's mother in law. The story of mother in law I read soon after is in Mark's Gospel too. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon, Peter's mother in law, was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her and took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Okay, first, I'm going to be honest with you. ChatGPT made this picture for me. But also, I've read this passage many times, and I don't even know if I should say this to a Canadian audience. I've told that been told that you're much more polite than Americans, but I'm going to be snarky. I was like, she gets up and waits on them? Seriously? Get your own water or bread. Like, don't your own 2 feet work? Um, get what's wrong with you? That's what I want to say to Jesus and his friends. I feel like Jesus would be okay with me pushing back on that. But I can hear you now, especially the seminary people, my dad. Laura, that's not the point of the story. Like, I know. But look what happens when those of us without seminary training read the Gospels. We see things scholars don't see. But then the Spirit nudged me. He's probably doing that now. Focus, Laura. Know me. Okay. So look again. Jesus heard Peter and he responded. Peter must have been concerned about his mother in law, I thought, because he told Jesus about her, not later, but Mark took the time to write immediately. Jesus went to her, Mark wrote, and he took her hand and he helped her up. And I read all over the Gospels how people would reach for Jesus and they would touch him. And even if they just touched his cloak, they would be healed. But I was so moved. It's the other way around here at Peter's house with the mother in law. Jesus did the reaching, he did the hand holding, he did the helping her up part. He didn't just treat the fever and then let her go wait on the men, right? No, he took her hand and he helped her up. I was just overcome by that. He didn't need to do that second part. It was like an extra step of generosity and compassion. And I felt him whisper to me, this is me. I am the one who takes her hand and helps her up. And I came to know who Jesus is as I read about his beautiful generosity and compassion. Matthew said he went through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease. and every kind of sickness. I imagine Matthew himself, what would that have been like? The gospel author, the tax collector. He had been previously excluded because of his profession, and he's now invited, follow me, follow Jesus, receive my grace. He was outside and now welcomed in. And Jesus saw people in need and did something about their pain. And then he provided his disciples with a mission. Go and do the same, he said. Go and be the same. Go teach and preach and invite and include and heal. He sent the 12 to go expand ministry and care for the wounded. He sent them to be Tov and to share Tov, to be generous, to do all these things that we tried to record on the circle of Tov. And so friends, that's our Tov example when we think about who we are becoming. Um, there's no easy transition really to the opposite to my next point. The posture that feeds the opposite of empathy into a culture. I really don't have a good segue here, so I'm just going to jump right to it. But this topic, at worst, narcissism, and at best, a lack of empathy. There's a continuum, right? And some manifestations of it are worse than others. But this topic, and I'm sorry to say, but it keeps coming up as we talk to survivors of spiritual abuse, those who have been abused or suffered abuses of power in Christian communities. Abuse of power by a person, it's usually a pastor, the stories that we hear. Um, they don't have empathy at worst, or they choose not to offer it at best. It comprises the stories that we hear most frequently. And this lack of compassion can manifest in all sorts of ways, some of them abusive. When survivors share their stories and describe the person who caused such hurt, we are often just so stunned by the lack of compassion, by the inability to be questioned or to be held accountable. And I've said aloud many times, how is this person a pastor? So it's time for my tangent. I'm going to go on a tangent about narcissism. Fair warning. If you want to tune out, now might be a good time because it's kind of ugly. But please know, before I get in too deep, I really do think that this term is overused. Now, not all leaders and pastors and ministry leaders who lack empathy or don't offer it in a situation have a personality disorder. I do not believe that. What we are instead zooming in on here is a lack of compassion, a lack of empathy, and how it can manifest in a culture and damage the culture. And good news here, I have a second source aside from my dad. His name is Dr. Chuck DeGroat. He is an author, he's a therapist, he's a seminary professor. He's also become a good friend over the last year. He's the leading voice for me on this topic. And DeGroat describes narcissism not simply as like how I was familiar with the term. It's not just self centeredness or arrogance. That might be how it will manifest, but it's much more. He says it's a deeply rooted inability to love yourself and others, and it's born out of this empty, insecure, and unhealed inner core. And these points up here, these are the most important points that I've learned from DeGroat that I'm quoting now. By the way, when I was typing this up, I texted him a screenshot. And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Oh, it's this thing. Who are you becoming?" He's like, "Wait a second, I'm writing a new book." And he sent me the screenshot of his new book, and I'm like, "It's called Who You're Becoming." And we had a exciting moment there. So narcissism shows up as an incapacity to offer empathy or care or compassion. It's not just about your own sense of a person's sense of self-importance. It manifests that way, but it's a real emotional and relational deficit. And he writes that narcissism is like this protective mask. It's like an impressive, very false self that a person builds to cover their own unhealed inner core, whether that's fear, most often shame. Um, Narcissistic leaders and individuals tend what we see a lot, they tend to treat people like tools or extensions or threats. They can appear very confident, very authoritative, very fierce, but beneath that is this really protective, fragile layer that cannot tolerate any sort of feedback or criticism or weakness. And that I bolded, that's what we've seen most often over the last 5.5 years with survivors of abuse. The inability of a leader to tolerate any feedback, to tolerate any sort of criticism or conversation about how things might be different. Then narcissism, de Groot writes, can often become institutionalized. So then churches, families, organizations, they end up protecting and enabling and even can reward narcissistic behavior. So they build around the part and they become a system that protects the narcissist from feeling any sort of shame. I've been inside one of these systems. I've been used by it. I've been hurt by it. I recently read this example from a memoir that came out last month. I'm gonna read it to you. I had only ever seen I'll leave out the pastor's name, under spotlights in an arena, pacing a stage, gripping a microphone as thousands of people hung on to his every word. In person, it was even stronger. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were in charge of the room before you even entered it. And here's the part: as he approached our table, his staff immediately all stood up. At his church, employees were instructed to always rise whenever he entered a room, or in this case, a restaurant. I hesitated for half a second before following their lead. He locked eyes with me and said, "So you're the guy who's going to make my book a bestseller." All right. So there's obviously more than one serious concern here, but my main point is this is what is inside a person's heart that requires a staff to stand when you walk into a room? What is inside a heart? Like, even if it was someone else's idea, what is inside a heart that allows a staff to do that? I'm honestly not judging. I've learned that there's way more to the stories than we just hear publicly, but I'm sincerely asking. I am concerned about the staff being treated as a tool, as an extension. The celebrity pastor may be narcissistic. I don't know. I'm not a therapist, but he's most definitely created a system where his behavior is enabled by the church, by the staff. And I have to ask, what is living inside this culture that this is what's happening? So, to summarize, and then I'm going to end my narcissism tangent, it's protective at its core. It's protective of feeling shame, of an inner shame defensive part that results in this chronic inability to empathize or love or relate healthily. And it oftentimes creates these unhealthy systems around it that protect it and then enable it. And if you've been around a narcissist or somebody that cannot give empathy, you end up feeling very forgotten, unimportant, unloved. They don't have the ability to feel empathy for you or to act in compassionate ways. And we all do this at times. Yeah, right? We all have our bad days. But for a narcissist, it is chronic. They are unable to do differently. You feel like they don't care about you because they don't. They cannot. And it's really painful. And I've come to feel empathy for the fragility of a narcissistic person. I've realized their disorder is rooted in really deep shame. It's hard. But at the same time, recognizing the relational and emotional damage that they cause in people and to systems. And I don't know why, but I've read research about how narcissists and pastors overlap. That's not my area. but I know that they do. I just know what it's like to be around one, including a pastor, and how confusing and belittling it feels, how you're left feeling unloved and unwanted. And I'm really, really sorry if that's happened to any of you in this room tonight. It's especially confusing. It's very spiritually unsettling when that person is your pastor, because then you have spiritual abuse getting mixed up in all the results. So, narcissism is extreme. There are varying levels of the personality, but what I've come to learn that all levels of like a person's protection of shame, instead of being authentic, they will counterbalance compassion and empathy in a person and then in the culture. And I just said a lot. My tangent is over. Maybe we can talk about more about narcissism a little bit later. But I'm going to be honest with you. We've seen a lot of it in the last 5 years, enough to be concerned about a real lack of compassion and empathy in pastors and church cultures. Okay, so I'm thinking, let's contrast Jesus one more time, and then we can move into our Q&A. I want to end with this holy moment in the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus saw the crowds, Matthew wrote, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. They were like sheep without a shepherd in Matthew 9. And I've read this verse many times. I think my dad wrote about it in Tove. I was like, oh, that's really nice. That's a good example of empathy for our Tove circle here. But I've come to learn from my one overused source that this word compassion is no ordinary word. It is much more than just the word. It's a vital one in the Old Testament, in the Gospels, where it is only used about Jesus. And also, my dad said of a figure who's like, tell them there's a figure in one parable that stands for God and they can see Luke 10 and 15, he said, if you want to read more. But I love this too. The word compassion is sometimes translated as deeply moved, and it's connected to restorative action as a result of being deeply moved. It's what we've been talking about this evening on the Circle of Tove. In other words, Jesus did not just like feel sorry about human suffering. In America, we say, oh, sending our thoughts and prayers. He didn't just say, oh, I feel really bad for you and then go walk across the lake. He felt empathy for a person, he felt sympathy for them. And the word describes his emotional response to the pain. He offered his generous, compassionate action by giving himself. Matthew says he took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Let's look again quickly at these. We'll skip this. Our 9 lives, these examples of compassion that led to healing and redemption. These can be named generosity too. Like how Jesus saw Peter's sick mother in law. He reached out to her, he healed her, he took her hand, he helped her get up. He did much more than just feel empathy for her. Though that's moving, right? That he would feel bad about her illness and stop and care for her, but he acted too. And I feel led to say here, Jesus loves the narcissist too. He loves the person that is unable to feel empathy. I would put them right there in the middle, the wounded, shame driven narcissist that hurt other people. That person is deeply loved by Jesus too. He wants all of us to come to him and be restored. He loves the narcissist as much as the one that's been abused. So, as I come to the last portion of this talk this evening, I want to circle back to where we started. Some of you are in seminary, you're headed into ministry, you are in ministry. I assume your path is taking you that way. You'll all step into a culture or you all will help build one. You won't build a perfect ministry culture because people are messy. There will be problems. Things will happen that you cannot foresee or plan for, but you can do something that will deeply impact the culture you build. You can cultivate your character. You can think about what kind of person you'll be and who you're becoming. I was in church recently. One more story, sorry. After the service, my pastor approached my husband about something that was really, honestly, it was quite inconsequential. Um, it wasn't large, but it was still there. And he just walked up, he reached for my husband's hand, and he was like, Mark, I really messed that up. I'm really sorry. I was like, I've never seen that, in the world that I live. But I sat there and I thought, that's not accidental. That came from a formed character, from a humble person who reflected on mistakes and then stepped up to take ownership of them, to be in right relationship with a person, even over something small. But that's what it is. That it's those small things over time that build character. It like Tove is not like a brand that you can just slap on a church website. It's not a quick fix. It's not like, come to this church, we're gonna be Tove. You can't make yourself Tove. It's the slow, quiet work of the beautiful spirit forming your character, forming the character of your culture. It's God's goodness letting that take root in you until generosity becomes your instinct, until it becomes who you are. And I realize I'm standing up here speaking, but I have not arrived. I do not think that I'm an example. I am saying all of these things to myself too, that our character matters and it takes time to form. We have to name what's broken and do the deep work of repair. And sometimes that takes really great courage, myself included, to reckon with what's within us. So tonight as I close and we move into a time of Q&A, I want to just ask for God's grace here. Let the God who is Tove form us into people of Tove. Let the Spirit grow all of us in compassion that moves toward people of generous action. I pray then that we could go out into all of our cultures and all of our ministries and classrooms and neighborhoods and nurture cultures of goodness that reflect the really generous heart of Jesus. So let's all be Tov. Thank you. Amen.
Thank you, Laura. Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Morelli. I work at Northwest Seminary and College, or College and Seminary. I've served on the faculty there for nearly 7 years, and I'm associate professor of theology and ethics. And I also manage our lifelong learning programming, which includes events like this, partnering with our fellowship parachurch ministries and churches to talk about topics and resource churches, people in churches, church leaders, whether you're a student or not, hosting these types of conversations because just because you're not doing a undergrad degree or a graduate degree doesn't mean that God isn't calling you as a disciple to grow as well. So I always love doing events like this, and I always say this, but whenever we do something, the question always is anybody going to show up? And when people show up, I'm extremely grateful, especially for something like this. It is not a comfortable topic, but you're here. You're willing to enter into the discomfort. And I really treat that as sacred. So thank you for your time. Um, Part of what we want to do before we really dig into the Q&A is actually have people who are already doing the work of Tove within the fellowship respond to Laura's presentation. So we have two people. First, we have Lori Wasselu, and she is the executive director of W.I.N.G.S, which stands for Women in Need Gaining Strength, which serves women and children fleeing domestic violence. She's also co-chair of the New Westminster Homelessness Coalition Society, as well as New Westminster Community Coordination for Women's Safety, and a board member of Baptist Housing. We also have somebody from Baptist Housing who's going to do a response. I just want to ask you, Lori, when do you sleep? You're very busy. But more seriously, I've heard Lori share about her work before. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I'm really excited about later on near the end of the evening. But let me just say, Lori has been doing the work of Tove for a very long time, and it's actually pretty courageous work that her and Wings does. So, Laura, I'm going to invite you up, and you can share some of your thoughts and throw a question or thought Laura's way, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Michael. So it's great to be with you tonight and lovely to have you here, Laura. So I do have the privilege of founding and serving in this Fellowship Pacific ministry for 29 years. Actually, when he says it's been a long time, yeah, I guess it has been a long time. And I just have the privilege of working alongside an incredible staff team who are committed to being the hands and feet of Jesus every day, 24/7. So Michael talked about what the title of the ministry is, which is Women in Need Gaining Strength, based on that verse in Psalm 91:4 that says, under his wings, you will find refuge. And our ministry serves the ones primarily who are the ones who are easy to ignore. Kind of like your chart of 9 stories, the ones that most Christians and church leaders have no idea of what to do with, the ones that are often unbelieved and judged. Every day in our organization, we are interacting with at least 80 children and women through our shelters and our programs, and connecting with probably over 7,000 women now over our inception in 1997. I've met a lot of women and children who've been impacted by domestic violence. Tove is exactly what our ministry is. Totally about demonstrating God's compassion, his empathy, his generosity, and his goodness to a vulnerable population who've experienced the misuse of power in their most intimate relationships, both in the church and in secular life. And I can clearly tell you that their experiences have brought devastation, desperation, deep wounds, a loss of self, and a sense of hopelessness to them. Often pretty extreme examples of toxic environments. I also have the privilege of partnering with Fellowship Pacific to provide a seminar titled Safe Sanctuaries. And that seminar focuses on dealing with church leadership, sexual misconduct, misuse of power, and domestic abuse in church, as well as offering a toolkit, to equip churches on how to respond when these things happen. And they do happen. Laura, in my experience, I have clearly seen through working with W.I.N.G.S and working with churches how the lack of empathy and compassion has been a key factor in misconduct and the misuse of power. And I really appreciate you focusing in on that attribute tonight of your circle. We actually use a bit of your Tove material in our seminar, the Safe Sanctuary seminar. There are two corresponding themes that I'm hoping you can speak about just a little bit more. The first is, in the work that I do, there's a strong sense of entitlement that many abusive people have, and also maybe access to special privileges. And you've outlined a few of those that you've seen in your experience tonight that comes alongside that lack of compassion. And in the work that I do, I see that it does create the ability for a person to see a woman in particular as a tool or a threat to that entitled position, and subsequently justifies that abuser's response and behaviors. And I continue to really struggle with understanding that justification. And that might be too big a question to ask. And it could be the subject of an entire workshop, I'm sure. The second is the lack of understanding about power and the dynamics of power imbalances that exist in every environment. I find that often the ones who are least aware of power imbalances are the ones that actually hold those power positions. But they haven't seemed to have the ability to connect the dots on the relationship between power and personal responsibility. We all have power, whether we're willing to admit it or not. We all have power. From my perspective, though, more power equals more responsibility to actually excel at being the first to do what is right. More power equals demonstrating more accountability to model transparency and humility with trusted mentors. I've recently been reading your book, Pivot, haven't got through all the way yet, and realized that you do dedicate some considerable space there to the topic of power. Would love to see you share a little bit more on that tonight. You made the statement that we need pastors and ministry leaders who let Tov transform them and guide the cultures they lead. I love the focus on consistently doing what is right and what is generous and having empathy as our first response. I believe that more education and understanding of these things will help us all to be Tov leaders. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Laura.
Wow, that was really beautiful. Um, so thank you for your ministry. It's really important. Yeah. So that was a lot. I'll do my best. I, I think entitlement seems to be a manifestation of narcissism. Am I jumping like too quickly into that? But it certainly produces self-centered, um, self-absorption that doesn't allow a person to fully engage and be present with another person and sees themselves as more important than the other person as a tool for what they want to get. And I can see how it's wrapped up into narcissism and power dynamics. When you mention power dynamics, this has come up a lot. So after we wrote A Church Called Tove, most of what we wrote about was about sexual abuse. We got letter after letter of power abuse, of somebody in a relationship with a person, typically a pastor and or leader, and the pastor or leader had abused their power in some way. So when you think of a power abuse, it's all like you said, all of us have power. As human beings, we have power. How we use it literally determines the health of our culture. How we use our power reveals who our character is. If there's a person using their power to abuse another soul, I'm sorry to say that reveals a really big character deficit. So the asymmetrical power relationship is like one has more power over the other. And you're absolutely right. Usually the one that has more power doesn't see what's happening or doesn't want to see what's happening. But as we always say, it doesn't mean it's not. And the person who has lesser power is the one who can describe what's going on. The person with lesser power is the one that's able to articulate it. And typically, it's not something that happens one time. It's a pattern of coercive, manipulative, controlling behavior. So that's what it is. And I've come to believe that just so much of what we've seen, sadly, over the last 5 years or so, is a spiritual leader misusing their power? Do you want to say more, Michael?
No, that was, I think, very on point. I have a little power test or idolatry test, I call it. What's the one or two things that if you were asked to give it away would cause you to be very uncomfortable, defensive, or even combative? I mean, evangelicals like to talk about idolatry all the time in the church. And when the preacher talks about it, they mention the top five, right? And if that's not your particular inclination, you kind of nod and smile and, oh yeah, yeah, I know. Oh, those people, they worship those idols. And here's the thing, it connects to what you're saying. It just puts the language of idolatry to it. Um, the idols that are most powerful in our own lives are the ones that we are terrified of being separated from. And so if you think about what you are terrified of being separated from, or the leaders in your church, the volunteers, if the answer to that question, what am I terrified of being separated from, is not Jesus, you probably have an idolatry problem. And here's the thing with idolatry, it hurts people. That's why God says it's bad. He's the only one worthy of our worship. And so with power especially, you the best way to handle it is to be willing to share it. It's like wealth, right? Share it. If you have trouble sharing it, you probably have a power problem. So just be willing to give it away. Because last time I checked, that's one of the most beautiful Christologies in Philippians, right? The one we worship was equal with God, but he emptied himself. And what does that look like in our own lives? That would be my only addition. Um, so I have lots more actually that I want to ask you, but we also have Q&A. But we also have another guest here, Matthew. So I'm going to introduce you, and then you can come up, and we'll keep the conversation going. Matthew Kitchener is from Baptist Housing, as I mentioned, and he serves as the Associate Vice President of Spiritual Care for Baptist Housing, and it's an agency of the fellowship and a ministry which houses over 2,700 seniors in BC. He served as a pastor in Red Deer, Alberta, and Vancouver for 20 years before entering chaplaincy ministry with older adults. He's been married to Esther for over 30 years, and they have two married adult children. And Matt loves hearing the incredible stories of seniors and Baptist Housing team members, especially when those stories are accompanied by a great cup of coffee. So, Matthew, please come up and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear them.
Appreciate it. Well, it is such a gift to be here tonight. First, to you, Laura, thank you so much. A church called Tove came to me at a pivotal moment after I had left my last church, and it helped me refrain a confusing and painful time. And it was so helpful. So, thank you. It's just a real privilege to be here. And with Lori as well. Lori chairs the board of Baptist Housing, so she's my boss's boss. So I'm a little nervous. No, it's just such a privilege to be here. So I have the privilege of serving at Baptist Housing. You heard a little bit about it, but it is a faith-based nonprofit ministry agency of the fellowship and sister ministry to Northwest, this congregation, and Wings. So we serve seniors across BC through communities of care that include affordable housing, independent living, assisted living, and long term care. In addition to providing a home for 2,700 seniors, we employ about 2,300 team members. And residents and team members are from as broad a background as the communities that we serve in. And Baptist Housing also has a foundation that provides funding for the fellowship and its agencies. So our heart is compassion, respect, teamwork, and we try to create a supportive workplace where people feel valued as they help seniors to live life well in supportive communities. And our mission starts by saying we're compelled by the values of Jesus. And that phrase isn't incidental to us, it's integral to our mission. Our mission shapes how we understand our work. And we say our first and primary value is compassion. because we hold that every person in our orbit of care, whether it's a resident, family member, or team member, is sacred, for they bear the image of God. And so our heart is for people to experience how valuable they are to God. So the team that I know best is a spiritual care team. We have a team of 18 chaplains, and I watch them pursue Tove with seniors and their families and their coworkers every day. They walk alongside people in very complex family situations in times of confusion and grief and loneliness and loss, and it is both beautiful and it is costly work. And so your description of Jesus tonight just moved me, Laura, the one who was deeply moved by human suffering and then acted. And I love that. Um, Not only does it communicate Jesus so well, and we as a faith community are seeking to live that out, but even in the healthcare field, there is a whole research on compassion studies. And so Dr. Shane Sinclair, who leads the Compassion Research Lab and works out of the University of Calgary, says that empathy requires virtuous action for people to experience their healthcare provider as compassionate. So virtuous action is absolutely critical. And that's what we aspire to. But I guess my question for you is that that action must be sustained by something in our interior lives. So Jesus gave and he withdrew to pray and to be with the Father. And you spoke of God's own goodness taking root in us. You closed with just the beautiful invitation to allow the Spirit to grow compassion in us. And so my question arises out of that, the ongoing nature of pursuing Tov. And so whether it's daily, like the chaplains I serve with, who they sit with a new resident who's confused and agitated and wondering why their family dropped them off, or like many folks here who may be on a long journey of nurture and resistance, pursuing Tov within a church system. My question for you is, how might we sustain our souls? You speak of who we are becoming, and you've probably talked to so many people who are living this out, who are trying to live this out within their systems. And so I'd love to hear you speak to the wisdom that you've heard from others, that you've lived yourself, about how we sustain our inner life, in our inner life, as we seek to cultivate goodness in the system and in others, particularly when it's a long journey. So thank you.
Ew. Thank you for your ministry. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to give a bit of an unconventional answer if that's okay. Um, I have a wonderful therapist who is also a spiritual director, seminary graduate. And in one of my sessions recently, I thought, I don't know, I should have told him this a long time ago, but I was like, he goes, "How are you doing?" I said, I spent most of my day at work, like, feeling like I was gonna scream and cry. And he's like, "Oh, what?" Um, it led us down a trail of he said, "I think that you might be suffering from burnout, and you need to pay attention to that if we don't pay attention to our inner life, it will catch up with us." And I said, "Don't worry, I didn't scream and yell at any of the children. I didn't start crying in front of them. I've learned how to cope." Um, but I guess my point in saying that is that we have to recognize in ourselves when we're feeling, I said, "I feel desolate. I feel like I'm not where I'm supposed to be." And I've spent my life teaching. It's been a refuge for me for a really long time. And he led me down this path of starting to explore what was going on and peeling back. And I say this, broadly now, like peeling back the parts of ourselves that we've exiled, the parts of ourselves that are protecting and managing, to get to the core of knowing who we are and knowing who the self is and who God has called us to be. So I agree with you. Like teaching young children is a ministry. I've come to feel that you have to be called, like you have to be called to it. It's working with a very vulnerable population where it's easy. I've seen teachers abuse their power and it's really sad, you know. Kids deserve to be treated the way Jesus taught them, you treated them with dignity and love. So paying attention to the inner life is really important. It really matters. If you don't, it will catch up with you. It'll catch up with you in your mental health, in your physical health. Um, when I say cultivate cultures of goodness, I mean that of our own souls too. Like if we have systems inside of us and those need to be cultivated as well. And like you said, Jesus withdrew. For me, taking care of who I am means not just knowing who I am, not just meeting with my therapist and learning how to heal. But it also means retreating and time alone in my backyard with God and Jesus and listening to what he's saying to me. And I can't do that. Ministry, I'm not in ministry the way this room is, but I am with little children in many ways and it can take its toll after a time. And I really think we need to pay attention to our inner lives or it will ruin you if you don't. Did I answer your question?
I'm just going to move this podium back because I feel like I'm inadvertently blocking all of you. There's a lot of wisdom to your response. And I had a similar question. It was a lot shorter and way less articulate than Matthew's because you sent your presentation in advance and I was able to read it. And I just wrote down, how do you avoid becoming cynical?
Mm.
And I'm asking for a friend.
Tika and I just talked about this.
No, but I actually I asked that, kind of jokingly, but it did come to mind. And I mean, first thing I'll say is I've taught a wide range of people, anything from first year undergrads to doctor of ministry students, everything in between. I've done prison ministry and done alpha with inmates, and I can tell you the hardest group to teach are young people, at least for me. Um, generally adults can regulate themselves enough in a classroom. But once you get kids in the mix, you have to regulate yourself and figure out how to regulate them. And I have never been stretched so much as a teacher than when I was teaching grade 4 and 5 Sunday school. And I actually mean that. Like, I'm not even saying this as like a nice, oh, I can relate to you, because I can't. I would much rather um, work with adults. There's just something um, that I find with young people, it's so needed. And yet sometimes it's always kind of compartmentalized within the church. Um, but even from my position within a college and seminary context, the area of theology I work in is in ethics. So nothing just sort of dusts down really neatly. I want to get into the places where Jesus meets us, and that usually means the really difficult stuff. So I teach a course on suffering, and if you start teaching trauma informed theology, that puts a sign on your door that says, "Come and talk to me about what you're carrying that you can't tell other people." And so, from my position within a college and seminary context, past, present, and unfortunately, I assume future students will come and talk to me about what they've been through. And that is why I think it's so important that we have these conversations. And it's really hard to not become cynical myself. And that is why I think it's so important with people in positions of leadership, influence, who are in charge of forming people, especially people in caring positions, that they're also practicing self care, right? And so I just talk openly with my students about how I see a therapist. And it's awkward for some of them because for a seminary prof to talk about seeing a therapist, that kind of messes with the dynamics, right? You know, don't, eh, Really? Are you okay? I'm trying to be, right? But where do we get this idea that people within leadership don't need self care? We're dealing with traumatized people. A lot of time, the trauma is invisible, but it's still trauma, and that affects the body. This is, what we're learning now in Eastern medicine is like, yeah, we've been telling you this for a while. Western medicine, it's all connected, and it's interesting too. Like scripturally, um, Jesus and others saw these holistic connections between emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical health, but we've kind of reduced it all to physicality. So this is just my endorsement from a higher education perspective for self-care, especially if you're working with people who are working with wounded people, right? And it's probably the most strong thing you can do to just say, I need help, because we've kind of valorized the self-sufficient church leader, and that's a ticking time bomb. So yeah, thank you for answering that question, because it is difficult. But I mean, evenings like this for me are very heartening, because it shows we're not alone. You're here. So at least you're curious. And that's a start. You're not alone. And the more that we do these sorts of things, hopefully more people start to show up. Um, okay. So we have a few questions here. The first one, and it was upvoted. It said, "Have you looked into abuse in marriage in the church?" Laura, you talked a little bit about this. It says, "There are people who are married to those narcissistic men and women. So how do you think the church should handle it?" And just, an observation to tack on here. Um, how certain theologies not only elevate a particular type of pastor, but they also elevate a particular vision of marriage that is working against Tove, not for it. And so I think this question is really meaningful, because I don't see the marriage question as sort of totally separate from the pastoral thing. I think it's actually a part of a whole ecosystem about what we say a good leader is, what we say a good leader isn't, what we say a good marriage is, what we say a good marriage isn't. So what are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I go back to the system, and how I've been in a narcissistic system, and not in marriage, thankfully, for me, but, um, the whole system revolves around the narcissistic person not feeling shame. So everybody protects them and enables it, and I see the marriage kind of the same way. So, um and it's not always abusive. It could be, but not always. It's more like we don't want and narcissism has this continuum, right? It's not always like, um in the clinical world, I think they call it like what's the most extreme form? It'll come to me, but my mom's a psychologist. She was
Of
like,
narcissism?
yeah,
Is it, well, there's narcissistic personality disorder. I'm not a
yeah.
psychologist either, but
Yeah.
yeah,
But at any rate, there's continuums, and the narcissistic person isn't always manifesting as like authoritative. They're not always. Sometimes it the root of it is that they absolutely cannot feel shame. So like in the system that I found myself in, everybody worked to keep the narcissist from feeling anything bad, and everybody filled a role. And I d I don't know the answer. I just know how hard it is, and sometimes people that are in it don't see literally don't see that they're in it. They don't see that the the narcissist is doing what they're doing. They don't see the role that they're playing in the system. I didn't see the role I was playing in the system until I stepped out of it and my therapist told me, right? And I had to work through that, like owning what the part that I had played to enable the behavior, and realizing that I was a tool in the narcissistic system. So I think there's absolutely a lot of overlap. Like the marriage is not my area. I don't know, but having seen it and been in one, I can definitely see the overlap between um what it how the system enables the protection of the person in the center not feeling shame in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of ways.
I think you also touch on it too in your presentation when you talk about believing and who do you believe when somebody comes forward, because that was one question that I had is what do you do when somebody comes forward and there's competing accounts of what's happened? And this relates to a question that somebody asked uh, online. They said, uh, where is it here? Somebody talked about, oh, if individuals with narcissistic traits live in darkness, what can a church do? Expose them, confront them, come alongside them, and encourage them to heal. Yes, the only point I would make is research shows that oftentimes when we envision a narcissist or we envision someone who's predatory or envision someone who's abusive, it's not somebody who looks very apparently that. It's actually somebody who's quite charismatic. It's somebody who's noteworthy in a community, right? So usually when people come forward, there's disbelief. What? I can't believe that person would do something. They're such a good guy. Or, in the marriage context, right? Oh, that's noteworthy, deacon in our community or elder in our community. Or do you know how much they give, how much they serve, how much they've done, right? Uh, like this is the thing. It doesn't always seem like somebody is, in darkness twirling their mustache. It might be, but I think this is where believing people who come forward really matters. And of course, oh, they could be, making it up to, assault that person's character or, get money from a court case. But do you know how hard it is for people to come forward, especially people who are typically silenced anyways? There is a lot of sacrifice and cost that comes with coming forward. So if somebody does, uh, chances are they're telling the truth and, do the research, talk to people. But yeah, it's actually the charismatic folks. And I mean, scripture tells us about the enemy too, comes as an angel of light. It's not very apparently evil and manipulative, right? It's right appealing. So I think that's very key as well. And so, especially within our context, theology of submission, headship, these are often weaponized to justify and excuse inexcusable behavior, right? And so, believe, protect, right? These sorts of things, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a pastoral situation, whatever the situation, just consider how much risk is involved in coming forward when somebody does.
Mhm. There's statistics that 95%, and some say it's even higher, of people that come forward are telling the truth. There is, like Michael said, there is enormous risk with coming forward. The Willow women lost, um, some of them lost everything. They lost their reputation, they lost their jobs, they lost community. There's great risk, and typically people don't come forward for that reason. So the statistics are really high that when they do come forward, they're likely telling the truth.
Actually, this reminds me of a seminar that I was in where Lori was a guest, and you said in your nearly 30 years of working in the ministry you did, out the percentage of the number of people that haven't been telling the truth was like staggeringly low
Yeah.
compared to the people who were. I can't remember what that number. It's probably, yeah, close to zero.
Yeah.
30 years
And
working
then
in a
when there's
ministry.
more than one, the number goes even higher. So, like, with Willow Creek, we thought, "Okay, there's no way that 7 of these people are all making up this story." But it's really, really hard for people. There's, like, this cognitive dissonance, but, um, this pastor led me to Christ. I came to know Jesus because of him. So he cannot possibly have done these things. And it's hard and it's really painful to admit, to accept that he did. I have never, you were asking, like, how do you not be cynical? I certainly understand how people struggle with, well, since he led me to Christ, or since I saw all the good that came out of the church or of him and the fruit that he produced, um, I certainly understand why you could not believe that there was this other side. I personally, I guess the way my brain works, I'm good at compartmentalizing, but I've always held, well, both can be true. He did these things and he did wonderful things for the kingdom. He led people to Christ. They both are true. Um, and to me, it's been encouraging, like, um, knowing who Jesus is and having encounters with him. And like I shared tonight about Peter's mother-in-law, that's who Jesus is, not what hurt you, not the abuse, not the women that have been situations that you described. That's not Jesus. That's not who he is or what we're called to be. Sometimes helping people separate that is one of the best forms of ministry that we can provide coming alongside.
That's well said. Uh, One question is, how do we avoid building Tove uh, into a way that treats it like a program or a formula? I think you were getting into this with sort of being and becoming,
Mm.
but it seems like some people want you to speak a little bit further to that.
Y This reminds me of something that happened at Willow. So after, and I'm not really trying not to be too hard on Willow, but that's my story. That's my background. This is where the whole thing started for me. I honestly don't know where they're at now. I wish them well. I hope things are going better. When the story broke, the elders got up and said, "Okay, we're going to fix it. We have a system where how men can work with women." And, you know, Bill Hybels followed the Billy Graham rule or he said he followed the Billy Graham rule where he never met with so I was like, it doesn't matter about the system. Like, he said he followed it and clearly he didn't. He told everyone else to follow it. Um, and sure, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with the system. There's nothing wrong with the process, but it's about who we are, right? Like, a person who has good character doesn't need to follow the Billy Graham rule, right? Not saying that there's anything wrong with following it, but it just for me comes down to who are we becoming?
One of my colleagues was talking about Dallas Willard, and he put his own spin on it. Jeff Cooney's a pastor within fellowship, and he's been working more and more with Northwest. But he talks about Dallas Willard talking about training off the spot. So Jeff takes this into the territory of sport, and I've got two boys who are really into sports right now, and I just love how there's so many analogies, like analogical connections between sport and discipleship. Uh, like, practice is so important, right? It's where you prepare for what you can't see coming. So if you don't develop muscle memory, if you don't develop a team culture, if you happen to play a team sport, if you don't work on the plays to the point where they're so ingrained in you that when you're in overtime, right? You're so exhausted, you're not thinking anymore. They're just in you. I think that's a lot like discipleship and about what you're talking about. And this was one thing I wrote down is how do we cultivate cultures of proactive discipleship and not reactive damage control? So, yes, have policies and procedures that are ready for worst case scenario. You don't need them till you need them. But also, this is a wider part of what you're saying. It's a culture, right? Culture eats policy for breakfast. And unfortunately, some of these cases are so complicated, you just can't see what's going to happen. So, how are we all individually as disciples, but as local churches, bodies of Christ, being formed to be the type of people that just intuitively know how to behave and what to say and what to do before it even happens? So, we're not scurrying to put out fires frantically when it happens, but we're all intuitively saying, this is who we are. This is how we're going to navigate this. I think that's critical. And I think, to call out schools here, I don't know that the institutions that have been tasked with training people for ministry have done a great job of this. Because, we're the ones who are supposed to be preparing people for ministry. Now, as a school, we are trying to do better, right? We're trying to change the way that we form our pastors, right? We're, like you said, asking the question, who are you becoming as a pastor, a ministry leader before you get on in the field, not once you're in it, right? And there's ways you can do that, but that is the exception to the rule often, right? We assume if we just aim at the prefrontal cortex and make sure you get the belief system totally right, airtight, perfect, 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 then we're all good. And I mean, I'm a theologian. I think doctrine's important. I think hermeneutics and exegesis and all that stuff is super important. But I also think this type of formation is absolutely critical, especially in the ministry context. I start getting preachy sometimes. I'm sorry. Um,
No, I love hearing what Northwestern is doing. Had a lovely conversation with Ruth, your vice president, and I was so encouraged that um the seminary is doing something so needed, desperately needed, where you're focusing on formation, not just the head knowledge, but the heart of who people are becoming before they get there. It's honestly, this isn't what you're doing is an answer to our prayer.
well, I think it also started too. My understanding is like well over a decade ago, uh, former director of the fellowship, David Harita, who co-authored the curriculum that Lori mentioned, Safe Sanctuaries, came to our former president and said, the way that we're preparing pastors isn't working anymore. Can we explore a change? And that president did not get offended because before he was president, he was faculty at that school. And he's like, yeah, I've been thinking, let's talk about that. So that's what it takes, is just to not take these suggestions as an offense, but just I'm willing to listen, right? That collaborative mindset. And it takes a group of people working together to do that, not just any one subject matter expert. Because this is another question I had is, um, getting away from the celebrity culture, the expert culture, even this like capital L leader culture, and I theoretically am so on board with that. But then on the other hand, too, there's a human part of me that's like, I love all of those things. And so you're all chuckling. So assumedly you get that too. So what's wrong with us, Laura?
Oh, no, I'm right there with you. We were at Willow, this was years ago, and Bill Hybels walked by with surrounded by his bodyguards, and I full out h like, acted like a screaming Taylor Swift fan, and my husband was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like he was like, "He's just like, he's famous, there's Bill Hybels," you know? So it takes both of us, like, sure, he behaved like a celebrity, but I treated him like one. And we fed, like, the whole system fed each other. What's wrong with me? I don't know, you know?
Well, I mean, I think we're swimming in the water of celebrity culture, right? And we want to feel important like the world around us. But I think it comes back to it's not a program, it's discipleship. And Jesus says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing, right? It's not just try harder, do more, it's lean into Jesus more. And that's a very different way of living, right? And we get it wrong, but it's a process. So, what advice would you give an organization? This is a question that has removed a narcissist and yet continues to face attacks from that person, both directly and indirectly.
Say that again.
What advice would you give an organization that has removed a narcissist but keeps facing attacks directly and indirectly?
It's going to take time. We've seen this. Just because the toxic person is gone doesn't mean that there isn't elements still living in the culture. It's going to take time to heal, and know that. Someone we spoke to was doing their organizational culture doctorate at the same time we were writing Pivot, and he told us He was one of my dad's students. He was like, "You guys have all the right ideas. You just aren't using the terms that we use in the business world." But he said it takes 7 years, that it takes 7 years to transform a culture, that it's deliberate and it's slow and it's not to be rushed. But it's not immediately gone when the toxic person leaves. It's still culture's active, it's living. It's like a lurking, um not a person, but it's lurking and it influences how you behave and how you think and how you answer questions. And it's always I've learned David Brooks says the New York Times columnist says that don't ever underestimate how powerful it is over the people in it. And often people in it don't see it.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I like to talk about is relationship beyond the Sunday gathering as well. Uh, Do you actually have strong relationships with the people that you're going to church with? I say one of the signs of a healthy church culture is just, do people in your church have meals together? And when they get together, do all those people look the same, talk the same, come from the same social class or the same ethnicity? Like, if you want to know whether or not your culture is forming this tove and is bearing the fruits of the spirit, it's looking like the type of community that you have in Acts 2, where it's a mixed group of people. And that is the type of thing that it's not just like, oh, isn't this nice? We're all friends here. That's actually the community that can sustain tax, like the ones this question is talking about, right? I know that person that you're accusing this of. I'm pretty sure, right? Like, of course, I said sometimes it's the person you least expect, but how are you forming relationships where people are truly transparent to each other, that there's trust there, and they've proven time and again that this is a safe person, this is a safe community. Um, that takes time. You can't rush that. But I think that's one of the things that we actually have to offer. Like, if we're competing with celebrity culture, we're going to lose every time because they have way more money and they have cooler lights, even the coolest churches with the coolest lights. You just can't keep up with Taylor Swift. All right. So just stop. What can you offer that Taylor Swift can't? The places where you eat food, right? The relationship when everybody else is abandoning you, you're there, right? And people are there for you when you're thrown out, right? When your character is being challenged, right? People who know you stand up for you. That's what we can offer, and that's what the world, I think, is so desperately in need of. Um, I had a question I wanted to ask, because you did talk quite a lot about empathy and compassion and generosity. And one of the things that I've noticed, and this isn't even just in sort of the wider sort of non-Christian world, but even within sort of the North American Christian evangelical world, there's talk about this thing, Laura, called toxic empathy.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so hot take from a Christian author and others who are reading her book and speaking publicly with a lot of people listening. Apparently, empathy can be toxic. Has anybody heard that happen or heard that term being used? Right. So there's this resistance to the idea of empathy and compassion. Um, I'm being kind of cheeky here because I'm just kind of, this is where we are now,
I
where you have Christians being like,
Yeah.
oh, the Good Samaritan story, the love your neighbor thing. It's actually talking just about Christians, right? It's not talking about just your neighbor, full stop. So these are kind of the gymnastics that a lot of people are doing to get out of the types of things that you're saying are so crucial for Tove culture. So that was one thing I wanted to hear you speak to, because there's a lot of counter discourse now against this idea of empathy.
Mhm. Yeah, I haven't dove in too deeply. I've just been kind of like, I like my dog when he doesn't like something, he turns his head
Yeah,
the
I
other way.
actually haven't gone in too deep either, because I only went about like an inch and I
Yeah.
couldn't.
Yeah.
You have to put on your hazmat suit.
Kind of, yeah, right. Kind of the same with me. We heard a pastor say the other day, I don't do empathy. And my dad and I are like, what? Like, cringe. What do you mean you don't do empathy? That's what you're supposed to do. Like, that's what Jesus, that's what he lived. That's what he is. So I don't know. I just have kind of turned my head the other way because it seems really ugly and you can only fight so many battles, Michael.
It's true. I mean, I'm just picturing an alternative ending to John's gospel where Peter is being forgiven and he's like, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter's like, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. And he's like, then feed my sheep. And he's like, actually, I don't do empathy. Like,
Yeah.
like how would that?
Yeah.
I'm not really into feeding the sheep. I just want to say that I love you, Jesus. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is where again, I mean, I suppose like I only have one move, but it's like discipleship. If we're doing discipleship well, we recognize lies when they come, or we say that's not the Jesus that I know.
Mhm.
Um, right. And so I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. But um, I think this is, though, part of our wider world that is often telling you that ultimately it's all about you, it's all about your thing, it's all about your self actualization. And then maybe once you sort of sort that out, then maybe you can help other people. And we get, inundated with those messages all the time. And now we have algorithms that like target it with our own personal branding and spin to hit all of the things that we like, which is different, everybody, right? So um we are being washed in the message of narcissism, right? And it being sort of labeled as good, but that's again not what the way and truth and life of Jesus really is. Um, so just mindful of time, I think we'll end with one question. One last question here, and it says, "What does it mean to cultivate justice with grace? Does grace require us to lay down our claims to justice and retribution?"
I don't think so. No. And I don't see them I can see the connection. I see them lived out in different ways. Um, just to make sure I'm clear, can you read that one more time?
Does grace require us to lay down our claims to justice and retribution? So that it's kind of setting up this question
Yeah.
of, can you be gracious
Yeah.
while also seeking justice and maybe, retribution and
Yeah.
reconciliation?
I would say if I had to I feel like I made this mistake, right? I learned through advocating for the Willow women that whistleblowers are not welcomed with open arms, right? That when when a pastor's been accused of some sort of abuse and you speak up and you're an advocate for those who have been hurt. Um there's a tendency the church or the pastor, if you will, is not like, oh, welcome, let's hear what you have to say, right? And I felt if I could redo, I would say that whistleblowers, those of us who advocate, have a lot to learn about being self righteous, being less judgmental. And it's definitely a tangent, a topic for, another day. But if it repeated itself, like, yes, I feel like I could have been more gracious while advocating for justice, that remembering I don't know the whole story. I believe the women are telling the truth, but it doesn't mean that I know what's right and wrong and I can just I'm not do you do the Enneagram in Canada? Okay. People are nodding their heads.
Oh, yes, we do.
So I'm an 8
Is
and
that
that
the challenger?
yeah, it's the bad one that no one wants to be. That's what I am. Yeah, it's the challenger.
I
And
don't
so
get challenger vibes. You must be in a great place because
uh,
what's the wing? The wing is when you get the problem, right?
I don't know what my wing is, but I know that I'm a challenger and it could be really my husband would be like, it's really annoying. So, but at any rate, the ugly side of my 8 can come out and my therapist will be like, set the 8 aside and just listen, you know? So, yes, I feel like lack of grace can manifest when seeking justice, and um, we have to be careful. I would put myself right up there. I would be less harsh if the situation repeated itself. I think the women needed someone to stand up for them, but I definitely learned a lot.
Yeah, I think one of the other ways that concepts like grace get weaponized is that, if you are a real Christian, then you wouldn't seek justice, right? So the implication is there usually from the person in power, whether it's person who are close to the person in power or the person who is responsible for the abuse, saying, you know, Jesus wants you to be gracious in this situation. And I always say if that's the theology that you're getting, the practice that is suggested, but the person saying it to you isn't willing to also practice it and practice grace and pursue justice, then watch out. They're probably a wolf in sheep's clothing. So, um, grace is about God's justice. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said, watch out for cheap grace, right? We're going for costly grace. Grace costs us something. And so there are situations where justice needs to be pursued. And yeah, I'm not an 8, but I also can be quite um, uh, intense. I'm a special 4, which means I am a special snowflake and all of you need to know it. Okay. Do we have any 4s in the room? No?
Which one's the 4?
It's the individualist. Yeah. Anyway, if you're a 4, we can all commiserate later. Um, all this to
Not
say,
as bad as the 8.
yeah. All this to say, I just have one final thing that I want to share. Part of the reason why we invited Lori and Matthew here is to show that that this is not just a one-off thing for the fellowship. This has been a commitment for quite some time. Northwest is committed to this, and I'm really excited. Actually, Lori mentioned the Safe Sanctuaries curriculum, and that's actually required of any new pastors credentialed in the fellowship. So to be credentialed pastor now in the fellowship, you need to do this training. And so one of the questions we asked is, well, what about people who are already pastors but haven't done this? So we actually have an online version that you can go on the fellowship website. It's totally free. You just put in your email and sign up. You can take it right now. So your churches all should do it. It's free. There's no reason not to. We are going to be offering a kind of micro course where there are the videos, but there's also live discussions with David and Lori. So you can interact with them. And if you want to do it for credit, you can actually do the workbooks and get some credit for it at Northwest. And that's coming in the fall. So check out Northwest Lifelong Learning. Check out the Fellowship Commons webpage. Like, this is not just a sort of one-off, oh, this is nice, we go away. We are strategically all in, committed to this. That doesn't mean we're perfect, but we're doing what we can to be proactive, not reactive. And also Southridge for hosting this. Thank you, Greg and Tikva. It's wonderful. So, and please thank Laura for coming. Yeah, all the way from Chicago.